He was considered a marginal upstart, too extravagant, too different from all the other artists of the 16th century. He called himself El Greco, meaning the Greek in Spanish. And I think that this was exactly where the strength of his talent lay. Hi everyone, Nina Shof here. Today we're featuring El Greco. I recently visited Toledo, where he spent the most productive years of his life, and today I'll show you his house, his paintings, and tell you a lot of interesting things about his life. Let's go. Domenikos Theotokopoulos, who would later be known as El Greco, was born in Crete in 1541 into a wealthy merchant family and took up painting as an adult, achieving great success. Crete, as you may remember from our look at the Renaissance era, used to belong to the Eastern Roman Empire or Byzantium with its Orthodox traditions, which it still maintained in the 16th century. Naturally, Domenikos became an icon painter in the late Byzantine style, which is easily recognizable and often seen in our churches. This style was marked by highly standardized depictions of figures, poses, and clothing. No self-expression was allowed. All Madonnas looked identical, with strict proportions, features, and even matching head and hand positions. It was the same story with Jesus. All the characters in the icons were essentially two-dimensional, and the background was flat or even completely uniform. Icon painting was more of a craft, within which the artist honed a single technique and endlessly reproduced it in his works without any variations. By the age of 22, Domenikos had become a member of the Cretan Painters Guild, which meant he was allowed to call himself a master, open his own workshop, and take on apprentices. Here it's important for us to note that Crete at that time was a colony of an Italian state. You might remember from my video about the Italian Renaissance, if you haven't watched it, be sure to check it out, that Italy at that time was not a unified state. The Apennine Peninsula was divided among independent states, the richest of which were Rome, Milan, Florence, Genoa, and Venice. They were constantly engaged in conquests, and Crete was a colony of the Venetian Republic, so it was connected to it by many financial and cultural ties. And in Italy, as you remember, at that time the late Renaissance or Mannerism was underway, and in Venice, the fame of Titian was resounding. Perhaps I should have told you about the Northern Renaissance first, but I still decided to share with you my impressions of Toledo and El Greco while they are fresh. The Northern Renaissance with Titian, Tintoretto, and Veronese will be in the next video. Subscribe so you don't miss it. So, in December, 1566 26-year-old El Greco requested permission from the Venetian authorities to sell at an auction in the Cretan city of Candia, now Heraklion, a panel on a gold background depicting the Passion of Christ. And it was sold for as much as 70 gold ducats, about 30,000 euros, the same price as paintings by Titian himself, an unheard of sum for the work of a Cretan artist working in the strictly canonized post-Byzantine style, where the artist's name was not considered very important. Less than 6 months later, El Greco moved to Venice itself, the most important art center in Italy at that time. All residents of Crete were also citizens of the Venetian Republic, so the choice of city was completely natural. As a citizen, he automatically had the right to study and work in Venice. It's like if we were moving from Sakhalin to Moscow today, and in Venice, the era of the late Renaissance was in full swing. Everything was full of bright colors, naturalistic depictions of naked human bodies, realistic rendering of light and shadow, endless mythical subjects, and linear perspective that made the paintings three-dimensional. It was a completely different world of painting, almost the opposite of the frozen and constrained art of Byzantine icons, a world focused on the most picturesque depiction possible, with the beauty of the human body at its center, and El Greco. All that remained was to observe and learn the style from the geniuses. He believed he'd surpassed them all and came to Italy for that reason. We have no records of whether he apprenticed with Titian or Tintoretto, but they were so famous that they could run their business openly, and their workshops were accessible to the public. Any young artist, even without officially becoming an apprentice, could come, observe, help out, and learn techniques and painting methods. Here, El Greco first discovered oil paints and experienced a riot of colors previously unavailable to him. Here, he also learned to work without a preliminary sketch. As practice, he used engravings and then transferred the outlines of the composition onto the canvas with broad strokes of black paint. It was here in Italy that he acquired the nickname El Greco, which means the Greek, and he adopted it for informal use. He continued signing his Greek name on official documents and paintings until his death. It is important to note that the late Renaissance, or mannerism, as I have already told you, is characterized by two features: exaggerated emotions of the characters, hence the term mannerism, and elongated figures and limbs. Soon you will see that El Greco will base his unique new style on these two features. And also, at this time, Titian was entering his most mature period, and his style changed significantly. He was so famous that he could afford to experiment. Black, deep, dramatic shadows began to dominate his paintings, which mostly depicted subjects from Greek mythology. Remember this, and you will soon see how El Greco masterfully reworks this discovery, although he specializes in religious subjects. El Greco lived in Venice for 3 years, honing his technique and modernizing his style. And in 1670, the 29-year-old artist moves to Rome, the religious center of Europe, a place where he could fully realize his potential as a religious painter. Here, in artistic circles, he meets Giulio Clovio, a famous miniature painter originally from Orthodox Croatia, which was also a colony of the Venetian Republic. The two immigrants with common roots quickly become close, and Clovio gives El Greco a letter of recommendation to Cardinal Alessandro Farnese himself, asking him to take the artist under his wing, in which he writes the following: "A young Candiot, a student of Titian, has arrived in Rome, who, in my opinion, is one of the best artists and a student of Titian." El Greco was mentioned as a clever move to give this brief resume more weight. In fact, it wasn't even much of a lie, since he really did study. El Greco admired Titian, respected him, but as I already told you, he was sure he would surpass him. Whether he will succeed or not, you will find out soon. Be patient. Cardinal Farnese welcomes El Greco, lets him stay at his estate, and introduces him to the city's intellectual elite. It is here, in Rome, that his style begins to take shape, so unique and unlike anyone else's, recognizable at first glance. First of all, it's the colors. You'll soon see that he often uses a burgundy wine shade instead of red, combined with pure blue, yellow, and less often green. Shadows deepen, inspired by Titian's latest discoveries. About the clothing, notice that the folds of the garments are always exaggeratedly emphasized. The light areas combined with deep shadows create a silk effect. He experiments with poses, composition, and subjects, but has not yet reached his most exceptional technique. The Catholic Church was in crisis, as Protestants seeking to modernize it had recently broken away. In 1556, after nearly 20 years of meetings known as the Council of Trent, church officials decided how to address new challenges. They developed a common list of prohibitions, which also applied to church art. Church censorship appears in Europe, which bans excessive nudity, eroticized poses of saints, complex allegories that are incomprehensible to ordinary people, and the mixing of the sacred and the secular. From then on, church art was viewed as a tightly controlled means to influence the masses, not as a way for artists to express themselves. After that, all religious topics had to follow dogma and get church approval. And even Michelangelo's Last Judgment in the Sistine Chapel would soon be altered, with the nude figures covered with clothing at the church's request. By the early 70s, these requirements were already customary. Therefore, El Greco was essentially shaped in this environment and was well acquainted with all the restrictions. That makes it even more interesting for us to observe how skillfully he managed to leave his recognizable mark on each of his works within the framework of dogmas, and this would not add to his popularity. After a couple of years living in the Cardinal's palace, El Greco had a conflict with his entourage. Everyone is indignantly discussing the covering up of nudity in the Last Judgment by the godlike Michelangelo. And then some El Greco, a foreigner, an adherent of the rival Venetian school, possibly even Orthodox, declares that he could repaint the entire fresco and would do it much more skillfully and chastely, even surpassing Michelangelo himself. The local elite couldn't stand that. El Greco was expelled from the Cardinal's palace in 1572, and he lost the patronage he so desperately needed. That same year, he paid dues to the Guild of St. Luke, the largest and most influential artists' guild in Europe, opened his own workshop and took on 2 apprentices. However, there were few commissions. He was considered a foreigner. Rome is not Venice, and other artists who were citizens of Rome had an undeniable advantage over him, even though they were less talented. The summer church frightened many artists, and some of them left for Spain. And in 1576, after 6 years in Rome, El Greco also left for Spain through his patron, the Croat Clovio. He meets Benito Arias Montano, a Spanish humanist and delegate of King Philip II of Spain, and Luis de Castilla, the illegitimate son of Diego de Castilla. The dean of the Toledo Cathedral. Toledo at that time was the religious center of Spain, and the Toledo Cathedral was the main cathedral of the country. And in 1577, at the age of 36, El Greco arrives in Toledo, where he will remain for the rest of his life and where he will create all his most famous works. At that time, Toledo was one of the largest cities in Europe, with a population of 65,000 people. The population of Paris, the largest city in Europe at the time, was only 300,000 people, while the population of the recently founded Madrid was just 15,000. His first important commissions in Toledo came immediately. The main altar and two side altars for the church of Santo Domingo el Antigua in Toledo, as well as the painting, The Disrobing of Christ for the cathedral's sacristy. Here in Toledo, his final style begins to emerge. First of all, these are the colors. I'll repeat once again: red, blue, yellow, and sometimes green. They are pure without any halftones. Black is responsible for the shadow transitions. The shadows are deep and somber, and human skin has lifeless shades. All his paintings appear to be created under harsh white light, accentuating bright areas and deepening shadows, which heightens contrast and adds a sense of unreality and mysticism. All his paintings will now be shown before your eyes, and I'm sure that after a while you'll be able to recognize his work among any other artists without any mistake. El Greco's early works were very well received by the churchmen of Toledo and established his reputation as a talented and prestigious artist. He received two major commissions from Philip II, the adoration of the name of Jesus and the martyrdom of Saint Maurice of the Theban Legion. However, the monarch did not like either painting, and it's not surprising. Just look at how much their style and composition differed from the painting conventions of that time. El Greco hadn't planned to stay in Toledo. He hoped to move to Madrid and join the royal court, but the monarch's disappointment with his first commissions prevented it. He didn't receive any more commissions from Philip II and was forced to stay in Toledo, where he was accepted as a great artist. His only son, Jorge Manuel, was born in 1578. The mother was Jerónima de las Cuevas, whom he never married, and who is believed to be depicted in the painting Lady in an Ermine. In 1585, he rented 3 rooms in a palace belonging to the Marquis of Villena, where he lived until the end of his life. El Greco's house is now a museum. I visited recently and will show you how he lived. The following year, he was commissioned to paint the burial of the Count of Orgaz, his most famous work. The painting, created for the Santo Tomé Church in Toledo, is still in its original location. The artist included local figures of his time in the funeral procession, including his own son. It shows a soul rising with angels around it. And here we see for the first time signs of the last and most important metamorphosis of his work, the elongation of figures. Look at the figure of the man at the top. His proportions are unnatural. His arms, body, and legs are elongated. Soon, El Greco depicted all figures like this. For example, see this painting from his later period. Here, in addition to the elongated body of Jesus, we also see extremely skillful shadowing on the body. El Greco used feathered brushstrokes, not aiming for precise depiction of the body's morphology. He had long abandoned the Byzantine tradition of painting by template, believing an artist is more than a craftsman. But only if each of his paintings is unique, and all his paintings are unique in the sense that you can distinguish them from any other artists at first glance. Look at these shadows on the body along with the long feathered brushstroke. They create a sense of fluidity in the limbs, as if they're writhing on their own. And this gives his paintings a unique dynamism and drama. His paintings also become elongated to accommodate the exaggeratedly long bodies. Check out the 1608 painting The Immaculate Conception. It combined everything the artist had learned through years of practice. The distinct colors, deep shadows, and elongated, flowing, nearly broken bodies. And one more final characteristic feature of his work, which is called the fear of empty space. Notice that in the painting there is almost no empty space. Every corner is occupied by an object or a character. El Greco actually constructs a mosaic of bodies and objects, twisting people's bodies in such a way that they perfectly fill the space allotted to them. His paintings from the later period start to resemble a puzzle made of bodies assembled under glass in such a way that they fit together perfectly and together form the rectangle of the painting. At the same time, the imaginary glass itself seems uneven, wavy, and distorts the proportions of the bodies beneath it, like waves would if bodies stayed underwater. We can definitely say that he anticipated expressionism, that is, the self-expression of the artist through painting. Recall how Van Gogh, 250 years later, championed transforming reality in paintings by adding his personal perspective and imagination? El Greco does the same thing, laying the foundation for the most important idea of his life, which he tried to promote. Painting is intellectual work that creates unique spiritual value, not manual labor or a craft done on commission. Remember, I always tell you that painting in those times was just a craft. A painting's price usually depended on its size and the artist. El Greco was the first in history to decide to change the rules of the game, and he did it in a very unconventional and I would even say radical way, which you will hear about from me. Most likely, for the first time, he went to court for his prestige. Here, I need to explain how the process of commissioning a painting worked. In the Middle Ages, the client and the artist would sign a contract that described the subject, theme, size, installation location, materials, and deadlines. The price was usually not specified in the contract. Most often the phrase, "the price will be determined according to the merit of the work," was used because the client could never be sure of the final result and was reluctant to commit to a payment in advance. And nobody wanted to pay for a pig in a poke. But the thing is, prices for all types of craftwork were more or less known, just like if we were hiring a painter. In fact, the price of a painting mainly depended on its size and the status of the artist. When the work was done, the artist would state the final price and bargaining would begin. El Greco took advantage of this gap in financial relations. When the work was finished, he would always name an inflated price, claiming that painting was not just a craft, but an intellectual and spiritual labor, which had much greater value. In 1577, the Toledo Cathedral commissioned him to paint the disrobing of Christ. They planned to pay 230 ducats, but when finished, El Greco requested 950 ducats. The cathedral refused to pay, and the artist filed a lawsuit, which lasted for 2 years. The court always brought in experts and outside evaluations, and El Greco insisted that these should always be artists, not craftsmen, who could appreciate the artistic concept. Most likely, he personally knew all the artists in Toledo who were worthy of being experts. In the end, the court awarded El Greco 350 ducats, and it might seem like a loss, but that's not entirely true. El Greco managed to officially secure a bonus of more than 50 for intellectual work. In fact, he legitimized a kind of artistic bonus, striving to ensure that painting was not seen as mere manual labor. However, the Toledo Cathedral never commissioned any more paintings from him, and this perfectly illustrates what was considered true art at that time. Simple craftsmanship could not be considered true art. For that, a work had to be unique and carry a special message or the artist's intent. It is precisely this unique artistic vision that transforms craftsmanship into art. Mass-producing identical items isn't art, regardless of how brilliant the original prototype is. This is the approach that many contemporary artists are guilty of nowadays, repeatedly generating art objects that are almost indistinguishable from one another. In 1582, he sued the Santo Domingo de la Antigua monastery, which had ordered a full set of paintings and sculptures from him. The work happened alongside the previous painting, making it a surprise for the monastery as well. El Greco requested 1,200 ducats for his work, but the monastery rejected the high price. The artist took the matter to court and won almost the entire amount. In 1603, his son helped him secure a new contract to build an altar for the Hospital de la Caridad in Illescas. The representatives of the hospital, having learned from the bitter experience of the artist's previous lawsuits, insisted that the final cost of the work be determined by an appraisal committee, but they themselves set the price at 2,410 ducats, and El Greco sued them again, resulting in a reappraisal of 4,000 ducats. And although he was still paid the original amount, he managed to secure an official premium price for his works. These three cases show us that El Greco consistently pursued a special status as an artist until old age. He was a foreigner with no connections, rejected by the king. He didn't have the same foundation as Titian did in his native Italy, and he had to be inventive to make a name for himself. I can say that El Greco was the first in art history to try to create a system where the value of a work does not depend on its size or materials. He tried to create exactly the system that exists now, where the price of a work does not depend on its cost and is almost entirely determined by the artist's name. I don't like this system. It allows many empty shells with loud names to exist in the art world, but at the same time it lets artists truly feel creative freedom as soon as they make a name for themselves. All these quarrels and lawsuits didn't bring El Greco any clients or popularity, but they gave him a reputation as a capricious and uncompromising genius, and he made effective use of it. In his workshop, which had 24 rooms and a garden, you could order a painting either from him personally or from his students, and the price would be different. He took on major clients himself, while he gave smaller ones to his students, covering the entire price range and even within his own workshop, showing that the master was worth more. In August 1612, El Greco and his son made an agreement with the nuns of Santo Domingo de la Antigua to build a chapel for the family burial. For this chapel, the artist created one of his final major works. The Adoration of the Shepherds is a masterpiece in every detail. The two shepherds on the right are elongated, their figures express amazement and reverence. Light, as usual, plays a crucial role, giving each figure significance in the composition. He died on April 7, 1614 at the age of 73. He lived a long and very fruitful life as an artist who, while staying within the boundaries of dogma, managed to create something truly unique. As a foreigner, he made a name for himself in deals and courts, earning fame as Toledo's genius. Toledo is literally filled with his paintings, and it has transformed from a religious center of Spain into the place where El Greco created his works. Most of the artist's contemporaries didn't like him. They considered El Greco's style to be capricious and pretentious, too unusual, and we can see why. And after his death, they turned against him completely, calling him insane. In 1800, Antonio Palomino, the author of the main treatise on Spanish painters, wrote about him. He tried to change his style with such extravagance that he made his painting contemptible and ridiculous, both because of the incoherence of the drawing and the tastelessness of the color. This same critic also came up with another phrase that would stick to the artist until the very end of the 19th century. What he did well, no one did better, and what he did poorly, no one did worse. Outside Spain, he wasn't known, until the world was shaken by Impressionism, until art began to break up into styles. And the artists of the early 20th century discovered that almost all modern movements in painting, especially Expressionism, had been anticipated by El Greco. At the beginning of the 20th century, major art institutions began to recognize the artist not as a whimsical madman, but as a genius ahead of his time. Several monographs about the artist's life were published, and a catalogue of his works was compiled. People started hunting for El Greco's paintings, and now no self-respecting museum can consider its collection complete without El Greco. That's how a Greek from distant Crete was tempered by Byzantine art, polished by the Venetian Renaissance, and took root in Spain, becoming one of its greatest sons. And if he didn't surpass him, he certainly stood alongside Titian just as he promised. An incredible story. But my friends, I have one request for you. I run this channel by myself, and each video is a tremendous amount of work, which is why they come out so rarely. Together, we've built the best art channel on the Russian internet. There's no doubt about that, and your support would really help me a lot. Please subscribe, even with the smallest donations here on YouTube, or on Boosty, or on Patreon. I'll leave the links in the description, and thank you for watching. Goodbye, everyone.